Lately, it seems every passing second brings news of another climate-driven disaster. But we still have the power to turn back the clock. Harnessing the power of collective human energy, today's university students are working together to chart a new future, demanding and creating the solutions for a sustainable climate. Our focus in science, engineering, activism, and politics offers the potential of a better tomorrow for all of us. Tune in to Campus Climate Corps for news of what is and what is not happening at this year's UN Climate Conference. Prepare for a livable tomorrow with a life and career of action. Join us and become part of the solution.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome so much to Campus Climate Corps' Day 5 daily briefing. Really excited to have a few guests on the program today, showcasing all of the activities going on at COP27. We have your best interests at heart. Our folks on the ground in Egypt are out there looking for those interviews, looking for the content that you want to see, making sure that your voice is heard as powerfully as it can at these events. So to all of our university students and everybody watching both live and later today and later this week, welcome to the program. Today, there's a few different headlines that approached us as we're looking for news and on-the-ground activity at COP27. Sisi, the president of Egypt, has come under fire from his own people in Egypt. Some of the folks that were prominent in the Arab Spring in 2011 are the same folks going on hunger strikes at the COP27 venue sites here in Egypt today, rebranding some of their massive potential that they had during the Arab Spring to also bring activity and bring attention to the climate crisis. Also, attempts for the US to talk about carbon credits, the selling of carbon credits, the use of carbon credits have come under fire, not just from other folks and delegates at COP27, but also folks from within the United States government as well. Even some of their own folks in the middle of election time are calling out John Kerry and the US presence at COP27 for their ability to, or for their attempts to say that we can just simply sell carbon credits and that's how we're going to buy our way out of the climate crisis. Lots of folks are really taking, pot shots at this, simply saying you can't buy your way out of a climate crisis. The carbon credits are simply a diversion and a greenwashing attempt to stymie actual efforts at trying to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Among other news right now, some of the indigenous folks that might even hear a little bit from Val Holly about what she thinks of that, but a lot of indigenous folks are calling out COP27 for ignoring their pleas and attempts to get heard. Also, lots of developing nations at this event are continually calling out COP27 for not showcasing direct discussions about how they are as a nation and as an economy going to industrialize, even amidst the ideas that the current attempts to industrialize will use up a lot of carbon with the lack of technology. That being said, we do have some interesting content today. Esteban's been taking some photos, getting out there into the action. Esteban, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Tell me what's going on the ground over at COP27 and what are your thoughts and feelings right now?
Good evening, everyone. So today we had our first day of the topics laid out by the Egyptian presidency of COP27. We started with Finance Day, and essentially it consists on a series of talks available through the COP27 venue. Today I went to talk about the role of central banks in sustainable finance. And if I may share my screen, I wanted to show you some pictures of this particular talk and share with you some notes on what the content was. So can you all see this?
Screen looks good to me.
The talk was again about the role of central banks in sustainable finance. They presented the particular issue as a set of and opportunities. It had a variety of speakers. Of course, there was the deputy governor of the Central Bank of Egypt. There was the Monetary Authority of Singapore. There were representatives from JP Morgan, a professor from the University of Luxembourg, among others. In particular, the talk began with the director, the deputy governor of the Central Bank of Egypt, giving a summary of what a central bank could do and what they have done for more sustainable finance. So the first point was essentially start with initiatives for adaptation and mitigation in the banking sector, incentivizing stakeholders, lowering the cost of capital reward. They suggested that central banks can always lead by example with their investments, and they can establish sustainable finance within the institution and create reports of sustainability and the sustainability of their activities with certain regularity. But a more comprehensive view, I think, was that of this man, the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Essentially, he summarized key initiatives that central banks can do. And there was some focus in monitoring risks, in the sense that risks can come in two ways. There are heat waves, droughts, floods, very physical impacts that can have consequences in bank investments. But at the same time, he also connected other types of risks that come from the loss of biodiversity, for example, and that have implications for food, air, and water supply, and that should also be considered among the risks. He expanded on the use of alternative scenarios, and he gave detail on some scenarios they have created within his work, and essentially one of the two main scenarios are that of an orderly transition into a green economy and a disorderly transition. And the IMF is actually using some of these scenarios. Then he went on the basic impacts that central banks can have in macroeconomic policy. He gave detail on that they can give guidance on net zero transitions, essentially regarding investment portfolios and domestic operations. At the same time, one of his final points was that central banks can act as facilitators to bring stakeholders together, and being essentially the origin of public-private partnerships. Essentially, the private side can provide capital, but in the context of a public-private partnership, the private sector would not bring up the capital until there is a better equilibrium between risk and gain, and that's where the public sector can come into the spotlight. Another interesting point was made by the last speaker, which is the professor from the University of Luxembourg, is this man right here. And what he said was considerably different from what the Monetary Authority from Singapore said. He said that, yeah, sure, risk assessments are important in the world of finance, but the focus at the same time cannot be taken away from public goods. And essentially, he summarized that the activity of central banks have to combine a public goods approach with an assessment of risk. All of this is to say that it was up to some point somewhat of a technically challenging talk. There were particular terminologies of finance that one may not be completely acquainted with. At the same time, one could leave that talk with a sense of emptiness, in the sense that there weren't that many of concrete examples of what central banks could do, and one would have imagined perhaps the possibility of a small macroeconomics class on the traditional objectives or functions of a central bank, and a layout of a new model of a central bank. That was lacking a little bit. But again, this was one of the talks that was available today in the context of the finance topic that was covered on November 9th.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that demonstration, Esteban. I am curious, a lot of the news headlines recently have been circulating about Africa's dependence on gas. So of course, the countries closer to the southern tip of Africa seem to use more coal, as that's where a lot of the coal mines currently exist. But nations towards, the top of Africa or the middle of Africa seem to be very dependent on natural gas, especially that of nations like Russia and other nations in East Africa who have their own gas and power plants. What is the sense right now, in your perspective, in terms of are these developing nations attending COP admitting that their dependence on coal and natural gas is stymieing the efforts of COP? And if so, do you feel that there is any addressing of those issues from developed nations as of this point? Or is the news correct in assuming developed nations are really trying to stymie all discussions of weaning off natural gas and coal by developing nations?
My impression, and from what I've heard thus far, is that developing nations are concentrating on the funds they need to make a transition to a green economy, and they thus far in the opening statements that we had yesterday, or in the pavilions I visited, there wasn't. They didn't address this particular issue of their dependence still on fossil fuel. So I guess that from a diplomatic standpoint, it makes sense that they are trying to focus on what they need, rather on what emissions they are causing. At the same time, yes, it's not that they don't have any merits in creating that, in showing that scenario, because it's true. They lack the funds, and sometimes they lack even technologies available in their countries, and they definitely need help. But yeah, thus far I haven't seen any explicit efforts into addressing that part of the work of developing nations.
Absolutely. And that's kind of as expected at this point, especially given the major criticisms of COP27 and knowing the track record of each of the individual COPs that have preceded this one. That being said, we do have a rather interesting interview to showcase with Nicola Sturgeon. Esteban, do you want to give him maybe a little bit of background about why this interview was chosen? We know that last year, COP26 was held in Glasgow in Scotland, where Nicola Sturgeon was showcased primarily as one of the primary champions, especially a primary female champion, of getting the discussions of weaning off coal, natural gas at COP26, especially showcasing the power of Scotland in terms of their wind energy. So we know Nicola Sturgeon is out there as a primary defender, at least showcased as a primary defender of climate action and a proposer of climate action. But tell me about this interview before we get right into it.
Yeah, so this was set up, and I think we told the audience a little bit about this yesterday. This was set up by the pavilion that Scotland has, separate from the one of the United Kingdom at large. Yes, some mention of those achievements and future goals that Scotland, and ambitious goals that Scotland has, were part of this conference. But at the same time, the conference also had a focus on what help and finances developing nations need from the developed countries. In the context of this particular conference, we had the head of the World Trade Organization. We also had the Prime Minister of Barbados, and we had the Minister of the Environment of Egypt. As we mentioned yesterday, it may not be something completely casual that the Prime Minister of Barbados was included, given its recent independence. And there was also mention of independence on the side of Nicola Sturgeon. So it's not too far-fetched to say that this is one example of the intersections of international geopolitics and some domestic tensions with the issue of climate change. And given that it seems likely that at some point there will be another independence referendum in Scotland again, that provides further support for that thesis.
Absolutely.
The first segment that we have is the one of the head of the World Trade Organization, and again, what she emphasizes is that one doesn't necessarily think first of trade in the context of climate change, but she does lay out the reasons why we should. And the second part, the second video, has the participation of Nicola Sturgeon, and again, the head of the World Trade Organization. Take a listen.
But I just want to tell you that sometimes you can have all the finance in the world, and if the trade policies are not right, you will not get anywhere. And that's exactly what Prime Minister Motley said. And that is where there is no tension, really, if you get your trade policies right. Let me just go back, and it's really essential in climate. I see that many of the nationally determined contributions, the national action plans, don't really incorporate trade policy and trade rules. This is the missing element, and I'm not trying to advertise, but I want to tell you that the WTO has done this report, which will be launching tomorrow. It's called Trade and Climate. It's a flagship report to say what is missing. You know, we are all missing this element. Now, so let me come back to this. The Prime Minister illustrated it perfectly with the pandemic. She talked about vaccine apartheid, the phenomenon of poor countries being at the back of the queue, not being able to get what they want. There was financing, wasn't there? COVAX had financing. I was one of those who founded COVAX. But we couldn't get access to the vaccines that were needed because countries had put in export restrictions and prohibitions against the export of these, either inputs to go and manufacture somewhere, the outputs. So if you don't have the right trade policies, you will not get what you want. And it comes back to climate. I have to say that let's not make the same mistakes that we made with the pandemic, because we risk being blocked. We may have the financing, but if some country decides they don't want to export their technology or the goods and services that will help us to adapt after an event or mitigate before an event, then we'll be blocked. So that's a key message that I'd like us to take away from this place, that trade policies matter. Now, I just want to also take up on what the Prime Minister said about, she called it a just industrial transition. And this is where I couldn't agree more. What we found is that supply chains, global value chains are very concentrated. Be they for vaccines, for some of the products that we need for climate, for low carbon emission, the growth path. They are very concentrated. And we found that we are very vulnerable during the pandemic, because if all these things are being produced in 8 or 10 countries and we cannot get them to the south where they are needed, then what happens? So we have to have this, she called it just industrial transition. I'm calling it re-globalization. But the idea is the same. How do we get a diversification of production of some of these goods to countries in the south? There are many who have the right environment. How do we diversify manufacturing to these countries and bring them into the global value chains? We kill two birds with one stone. We build resilience for the world, but at the same time we include those who have been left out. So we have a new name for the same phenomenon, but the South must be part of the answer to climate, dealing with the climate epidemic or pandemic. It's the same thing. You know, climate change is causing the same kind of problems that we had with the pandemic, and the two are linked, and we need to solve them. So, Mariana, one last thing about finance, if I may. I just want to say that, you know, there are various types of finance that we leverage from the public sector, that we have from the public sector that we can use to leverage private finance, as the minister also said. And the WTO rules, the only thing that we say is, as long as whatever policies put in place using the financing does not discriminate against others, then we're okay. So when people are talking about WTO rules, you have to be careful what you're saying. If it is some kind of tax that favors your own domestic products and discriminates against others, then you're going against the WTO rules. But if it doesn't do that, you have climate policies that don't do that, then we're okay with that. And right now, one of the things we are advocating at the WTO as we are looking at finance is a carbon pricing framework, a global carbon pricing framework. We have 70 fragmented systems in the world as we speak. Different countries have different carbon taxes, different pricing regimes, regulatory frameworks that seek to tax carbon emissions in one way or the other. But imagine businesses trying to deal with it. Imagine developing countries trying to figure out what to do. It is very complicated. We are advocating at the WTO a global pricing framework which will take into account the target with want of 1.5 degrees or below, the Paris Agreement, common but differentiated responsibilities. Those who pollute the most or polluted will have to pay more in this taxation scheme. The poorer countries who didn't pollute as much will pay less. And in this pricing scheme, we've also recognized the need to set aside about 20% of whatever proceeds come for climate finance, and it could be for loss and damage. It will have to be decided. So support us in what we're doing at the WTO. We are with you. We need this financing to help developing countries to adapt, mitigate, and deal with loss and damage. Thank you.
So, well, firstly, before I address that point, I agree so much with the points that have been made by Mia, Hala, and Ngozi. And I'm really struck here by the sense of the moral force behind all of these arguments. You know, we often talk about the climate finance debate in terms of acts of charity from the north to the south. It's an obligation, and it needs to be seen in those terms. We can't have countries of the global south suffering double jeopardy. The north needs to step up and provide the finance and do it properly in a way that doesn't deepen the indebtedness of countries in the South. We need the reform of the financial institutions, and we so need loss and damage to be a part of this debate in a way that it hasn't been before. It's not just about mitigation and adaptation. We need to see that obligation expressed in the willingness to address loss and damage directly. In terms of how we're approaching this in Scotland, and we've learned a lot from the advice you've given us, Mariana, I think there are three principles that I would reinforce here, and the final one will come to the final comment of Mia. Firstly, it's about the responsibility of leaders to set the vision and the strategy. You know, we were talking about it backstage, we talk about crowding in private finance. That's not the end, that's the means to the end. So we need to be clear, what is the private finance for? That's the mission. Our National Investment Bank that Mariana helped us set up is a mission-oriented institution. It's about getting finance for a purpose. So that's the first responsibility of government. And then, yes, we use public finance to crowd in, mobilise private finance, de-risk private finance where we need to do that. But the third principle is conditionality, obligation, call it what you want. Prime Minister talked about rates of return. Private companies invest to get a rate of return, but that rate of return only comes about because they exploit our natural assets, they use the infrastructure that's so often created by public investment, the skills and the education that is paid for through public finance, and therefore it can't just be about investment to deliver a rate of return. There has to be a contribution. Yes, a contribution to make up for the causing of the problem, the climate problem that we're dealing with, but the Prime Minister is also right. A contribution from those who will benefit hugely from the solutions. And so conditionality has been at the heart of how we're trying to do this in Scotland. So demanding commitments to fair employment, demanding that there is a commitment to building local supply chains. In ScotWind, which is our offshore wind programme, which we're looking forward to collaborating with Barbados around, we made requirements or asked for requirements that's delivered, and it has to be implemented, but it's delivered at this moment in time. For every gigawatt of offshore wind energy that we are seeking to generate, there's commitments from the private developers of £1 billion of investment in the supply chain. So that's what we need to do. My final point is picking up on Ngozi, which I think is absolutely correct, and the Prime Minister made this point too. All of us desperately want to capture the benefits of the transition, the industrial benefits of the transition for ourselves. But if we all do that, we're not going to maximise the benefit overall. This has to be about distribution. So while we focus, and we're very focused, and that's the strap line up there, on the just transition within Scotland, you know, we're an oil and gas country that's transitioning to renewables. That has to be a just one. But the just transition has to mean justice between the North and the South globally as well. And these are the principles that need to guide everything we do.
Which is really interesting, because when we talk about outcomes-oriented procurement, precisely in that mission-oriented way, what's so interesting in terms of what Mia mentioned is that what looks like outcome-oriented policy in one country often goes against another country. So what does it mean to have solidarity in a collective public good in these outcomes-oriented? The Defense Production Procurement Act that the U.S. is currently using, even just to supply baby formula, which they're out of, you know, if you actually look at how the supply chains are effective, what does it mean to look at that in an international sense?
Mariana, can I just, you know, you're saying that, you know, we're all very concerned now about the tense geopolitics that we're living, that is getting worse, not better. But I think that leaders really need to sit down and decide what are areas of strategic cooperation alongside strategic competition, which is, it exists, we cannot do away with that. but I don't think that there's a common view of strategic cooperation. Some things of the global commons that no one country can solve on its own. Once we get that agreement of strategic cooperation around certain global commons issues, some of these things that we keep talking about will fall into place. So I still think a conversation is needed on this issue. Not everybody is on board.
I'm with you. But, you know, it comes back to a point you've made that I reinforce. I mean, I agree with everything the Prime Minister has said there. You know, we face an increasingly simple choice. We either choose to survive together or we die separately. That's the startness of what we face. And, you know, I think it is hard to stay optimistic, but I'm not sure we've got an alternative. We need to keep driving forward. The point I want to agree with, and I'm certainly happy if we maybe can devise an initiative out of this to bring these organisations together. But it can't be left to the governments of the powerful countries. We need to bring others together. I'm sitting here as a non-state actor. Scotland's not a member of the United Nations yet in our own right. But we try to convene others through the Under 2 coalition. We need to bring oil and gas companies and the other big, powerful players into it. We share a national day as well.
I thought you were sitting next to me to know what it is to have a national day on November 30th.
We may end up sharing Independence Day, who knows? I'll go to Barbados to celebrate it one year, and Mia can come to Scotland the next year. Anyway, that was a slight digression there. But we need to use the power of everyone that has a part to play here. So that's non-state actors, whether governments like mine, oil and gas companies, others. We have no choice here, so let's try to leave here with a bit of optimism, because the alternative frankly doesn't really bear thinking about.
You know, I find Nicola Sturgeon to be a really fantastic politician. She does an excellent job highlighting the cases about the Western nations and their need to increase and step up the funding. Although the biggest question, as always, is where's the funding coming from and where is it going? As many of you listening know, and I've received a few emails from you as well, there is a lot of speculation and a lot of doubt regarding where funding goes and into whose pockets does it go. Many developing nations have a track record of money falling into the wrong hands at a very fast-paced rate, especially in some of the nations in the global South, which is why the proposals by Nicola Sturgeon with regard to technology, I think, are really crucial about where technology is going and how fast technology is being exported, as fast as how money is being exported as well. Esteban, did you have any lasting thoughts on Nicola Sturgeon's talk?
Yeah, connected to that, it was very interesting. She is, again, yeah, I think a very good politician. She's pretty straightforward. And I think that's why people like her in general. Her point about conditionality is very interesting and could be applied to what you say in terms of how money could get to the global South and sometimes ends up in the wrong hands. In that sense, some aspects of the legal conditionality of the funds that she's using domestically could be interesting in that framework. Political ecology is definitely a field to read if you're interested in. I think that it has some coverage you can use regarding the effects of money being sent on the way of the global South and sometimes ending up not being used for what it was intended originally and not for the benefit of the population of the global South. This is not to say that the global South doesn't have that capacity. It does, but again, some aspects of its inner workings of its governments have to be readdressed, and some aspects on the other side of the line have also to be readdressed, and political ecology can definitely provide some framework for that. I did again like also the conditionality aspect she talks about in her domestic scenario, because of how the private sector uses public conditionality on the funds given also to the private sector domestically, in her case, in the process of creating green jobs, for example. The other point that was interesting was that of the head of the WTO about the lack of unified carbon pricing. But it ties also with what we were discussing the other days, that there is also there isn't also a unified carbon accounting system to begin with. So the pricing comes next. First, we have to for sure create a good unified carbon accounting system, and then we can talk about a unified carbon pricing system. But those aspects were very interesting of this conference, and I'm apologizing in advance because the recording was a bit shaky, but this conference was packed. It was in a pavilion. It wasn't a conference set up by the UN itself in a room with a lot of chairs. And it was packed. The other thing I learned was that photographers and reporters are merciless, and they'll scramble for space. So the shakiness that you see is me scrambling for space with real experts in doing that.
You know, I remember when I was getting my interview with John Kerry a couple of years ago, and this reporter was absolutely merciless. Here I am, you know, Mike LaPel right up to John Kerry, and he's giving me an explanation. Reporter just absolutely shoves me aside. I turn around, I'm like, that's not going to happen. Anyway, we just got like a quick phone thing from him. Anyway, Rhonda asks a really good question that we're going to, I think, get to at a later date. Rhonda asked, are there good calculations of each country's contribution over time with regard to carbon emissions, and can liability be assigned based on those numbers? That's a really good question, and I think it will be talked about in a couple of days when we start talking about, you know, more getting more into depth into historical carbon emissions. And it is a multifaceted question, especially when we have companies like Microsoft making commitments and pledges that they intend to account for every molecule of carbon that they have secreted since 1980 in their founding. Although there are lots of attempts to call out Microsoft for the use of carbon credits and buying out their way out of their carbon problem, but we will be discussing that at a later date. Okay, next we have a little bit of a segment from our very own Michael Fidler, and then we'll go into Valhalla and Delaney and wrap up with Dr. Capiz. So stay tuned real quick while we discuss, or we showcase a little bit more about what's going on at COP27 as we speak.
Today, COP was focused on finances. So I will try to provide a quick overview of what I saw and what I experienced. First, I noticed that COP is pretty full already. There are thousands of people walking by, visiting the various sessions, so COP is at full swing. The various pavilions opened already. Many presentations going on today. But I want to take a look at the finances from a slightly different perspective, and let me start with energy, because more than ever there is a need for energy, and if you have the finance, you can afford the energy as well. And COP definitely can afford its energy, because there are these huge AC units producing the cool air all the time. Of course, among the AC units there are these muscle-powered bikes, and nice contrast, I would say. And I spent quite a bit of amount of time in this media center on the left-hand side, and it's freezing cold there, and just behind the window there is a hot desert. The contrast cannot be any sharper. So I spent in the media center 15-20 minutes and need to go outside to warm up, although I have 2 sweaters on. So out of curiosity I went just to see how the AC looks like, how it is powered. Talk to this engineer, he was just showing me some electrical stuff, so you get a view how some of the how COP gets powered. Now, I'm sure that in many of the sessions there was discussed the issue of providing direct financial support. But let me give you a small example why I don't think it is the right approach. There are these free bikes in town along the main road, and all you need to do is download an application, get a scan, and then you get the free bike. The bike is probably worth $100. Getting a SIM card is probably worth $5. So I've seen many of the local kids already figuring this out and fighting for getting the bike. These two kids actually got in a real fight. Another example of having and not having money would be, say, housing for the delegates. You can afford it, you live in a place like that. You can't, you probably head for a youth hostel. So I was just curious how the youth hostel in Sharm el-Sheikh looks like, and this would be the side entrance to the youth hostel, and this would be the backyard. I really didn't want to stay here, and it's not that I would be searching for a place like that in the backyard. The trash was just everywhere. In this specific town, simply finance has an extreme power. You have the money, then you can walk around and buy all kind of perfumes and spices and souvenirs and so on. It's all nicely and neatly arranged, and then you can spend a romantic evening on a beach, or spend the whole day on a beach, and in the evening take images like that, being glad that you are here and having a nice time, because the town, I mean the beach it's very nice. But then you go to town and you just walk behind the resort walls, you see the old town, and then you get to the area where the local people live. And it's how it looks like. This is not an arranged photo. This is not that I would have to search for that somewhere in backyards. I simply just walked to the old town, went behind the last house on the street, and these are the images taken there. This is nothing that I would arrange or really search for that. This is how it looks like. I went up the hill. On the horizon you see the ocean, then you see the old town or the souk, and then that's what you get at the edge of town, and it's everywhere on each side. So here I was just crawling deep up to my knees to get on top of the hill. I couldn't almost get down from the hill because the trash was just everywhere. I wouldn't say that it's all fault of the local people. The tourists have their fair share as well. So just a last image from this series, I believe. That's just a small girl on a hair sort of a balcony, a local girl. That's where she lives. Then I climbed the hill, spent there, waited for the sunset, and was just thinking about all these issues. So I recommend that you do the same. Final images from today. One of the main sponsors of this COP is Coca-Cola. They were giving some free drinks today, and there was a huge interest in them. People were saying, can I have 2 or can I have 3? And the 200 bottles I saw there were gone within 2 or 3 minutes. This is how the area where the free drinks were available looked like after 2-3 minutes. I guess you get my point. So with being this said, this would be all from me today.
Well, I certainly hope that each of you coming back to the USA brings me back a souvenir or two that looked very entertaining. Also, enjoy that romantic beach walk. Next, we're going to move straight into Valhalla. And why don't you go ahead and introduce your guest while you're at it? Welcome to the show, Delaney.
Welcome to the show, Delaney. Indeed, this is Delaney Reynolds. For those of you who participated in the first day of briefings where we were all talking about COI, I mentioned that I was on the Reynolds v. Florida lawsuit. For those of you who weren't there for that, I was on a lawsuit with 7 other youth plaintiffs a few years back, and it was recently dismissed, but it was a case fighting for climate change and like constitutional rights of children and future generations. And the named plaintiff is with us right here, Delaney Reynolds. Take it away, Delaney.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Val Holly, for inviting me, and thank you to Rock, John, and Esteban for having me.
Just be sure you speak a little bit closer into the mic if you can.
Sorry,
Thanks.
we're sharing some headphones here. My name is Delaney. I'm from Miami, Florida. So I grew up in the Florida Keys and in Miami and around water, and always loved nature. And eventually I got involved with climate change activism. I started my own nonprofit organization called the Sink or Swim Project. And it focuses on education. So I give presentations about climate change, the science, the solutions, stuff like that, with a focus on the youth generation, because I think it's our generation that is going to have to solve the climate change crisis. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's great that we're able to have the privilege to attend COP conferences like this and kind of be a part of the discussion. And then the other aspect is political advocacy. So, lawsuit. We've also, Val Holly and I worked together to petition for a rulemaking in the state of Florida, where the Commissioner of Agriculture actually adopted a rule that we drafted for her, saying that the state of Florida is now going to try to achieve the goal of 100% renewable energy by 2050. So that's something really cool that we worked on as well. And there's some more news on that coming soon. So if you are interested in that, I would check out an organization called Our Children's Trust, which is the organization of lawyers that we work with, or you can follow my social media at miamiseries.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Welcome to the program. If anyone wants to check out My Children's Trust, Delaney, why don't you go ahead and send me those details, and I'd be glad to pass them on to our listeners. Okay, Dr. Capiz, it is now time for us to talk a little bit more about what you have been seeing over in COP27. How has it been going on your end?
Well, finance has been a big issue for us and our participation in COP27. Our entire group has experienced some of the trials and tribulations of, let's say, investment in a developing economy. Investment is often predicated on contracts and meeting expectations, but it's also predicated on supply and demand. So in planning for our participation in this COP, we made housing reservations, as we do each time we visit one of these COP cities: Madrid, Glasgow, Paris, etc. And some venues are more expensive than the others. We were thrilled initially when we heard in Glasgow that it would be in Sharm el Sheikh, and we looked up the expenses and promptly made our reservations for an bargain basement rental, which is the typical housing market here for rentals, and paid like $1,100 for a couple of weeks, almost 3 weeks stay. And a month before our journey began, I get an email from Airbnb saying that, gosh, unfortunately, the owner of the condo has decided that they're having some water problems, with the unit, and they're just going to have to cancel your reservation. So I promptly went out and made reservations to replace that, and that cost just shy of $4,000. So a factor of 4. And then as we're on our way here to Sharm el Sheikh, I get a notice from that owner saying, gee, we're just there was some miscommunications and we're going to have to cancel that reservation. But fortunately, the resort where that canceled reservation was located said that they could provide us housing with no trouble whatsoever. But it costs a little bit more. Instead of the $4,000, it would cost $11,500. So we, when you inject money into an economy, supply and demand takes over, and what cost a humble amount just moments before, all of a sudden increases in cost by a factor of 10. So that's an important consideration when planning financial investments in developing economies. And as the video pointed out, the key issue is, what are you getting for that investment? And it's not always clear what you're getting. And we need to keep in mind that this speaks to what we've been focusing on all along within Campus Climate Corps, which is the metrics. Developing accurate and dependable ways of measuring productivity towards addressing this climate crisis. So finance, as the speakers pointed out, they need to make sure that they are achieving the metrics. Now, when it comes to the private sector, finance is simply a tool for generating returns on investment. And they're looking for cash. They're looking for financial returns. But, you know, it's that mentality, it's that economic approach that got us into this mess to begin with. So we could just be perpetuating the system unless we make some fundamental alterations to the criteria and the metrics associated with the decisions on the financial investments. Now, a government is different. A government will have a different expectations as far as what it constitutes return on investment. When a country is embroiled in a war and they begin to invest massive amounts of their national wealth in winning that war, their objective is not to make a profit necessarily, but to just survive that war and come out as a viable entity at the other end. So whereas we're making decisions on investment right now that are more akin to traditional investments with financial return on investment, cash returns, once the climate crisis really kicks into gear, there's going to be a shift over towards the government perspective on emergency investment and what return needs to be achieved there. Now, another thing that we have to keep in mind is when we're making investments, when you set up new categories, new incentives for entrepreneurs in a nation, often they don't necessarily change what they're doing. They just simply change how they describe it. You know, that's a process called greenwashing. And we've seen that in our own nation. You know, I've dealt with water quality projects for decades in Florida. And it was very clear that once the government set up certain programs to fund water quality improvement projects, all of a sudden, the traditional drainage projects all of a sudden got reworded to emphasize or to put a spin on them as to their water quality function. And often it was totally fictitious. Basically, they just changed the verbiage and they were using water quality funding to do projects that were in fact damaging water quality. So we have to make sure that resiliency and adaptation investments are not simply funding projects that are masquerading as resiliency and adaptation and are in fact simply just traditional development and profit-making enterprises. Now, assuming we can get what investments do occur focused on the right types of projects, there's still the challenge of climbing the investment curve to where we can deliver what's necessary. Now, in the conference we held on November 4th, we had a speaker from the Climate Policy Institute that spoke about some of their research and work on this. And I'd reviewed an article written by the CPI, and they talked about in this article the need for globally the investment in the climate crisis to reach $4 trillion a year. And that's not immediate, but that's, you know, sometime in the future. Now, again, when you compare the climate crisis to a war and perhaps World War II, the investment just by the United States, if we invested the same amount we invested in World War II, would be $7 trillion a year. And the CPI is simply saying we just need $4 trillion a year globally. So there's a big disconnect between 4 billion for the entire world and 7 billion for a wartime effort by a nation like the United States. But let's take that $4 trillion number and work with it. And if the USA is 25% of the global economy, then our share of that $4 trillion would work out to 1 trillion, or 5% of our GDP. Now, on the military, our traditional number is on the order of 2 to 4% invested in the military. So we're talking about an operation in the United States of total financial investment exceeding that of our current military budget. But we're a long way from doing that. So how do we get from where we're at to where we want to be, and where are we, in fact, globally? Now, CPI also broke down the current spending, which they put at about $632 billion a year globally on climate. And they estimate that about half of that, about $321 billion, was coming from public sector or governments, and that $256 was coming from corporations, banks, and other investors, and $55 billion was coming from households. So again, if we use 25 to 33%, then the USA share is probably on the order of $160 to $210 billion a year. But that's still only 10% of what it needs to be. If we take that upper number of $210 billion a year, and we need to get it to $2 trillion a year. So it's quite the challenge to climb that curve, and we need to do that. And it's hard to understand whether or not we'll be able to do that, because it's so dependent upon electoral politics in our nation. And we just had an important election yesterday, and in Florida, it was a resounding victory for the Republicans, basically a 60-40 election at the gubernatorial level. And that's an amazing margin for a state like Florida, which in past years has decided these by tenths of percents or single percentage points. So it's not entirely certain that we're on the right track for preparing ourselves to climb this investment curve as we need to do. But Iraq, we had Matthew from the CPI as a speaker. Maybe you could share with us some of what he discussed during that presentation, which people can see on the YouTube site of Campus
Absolutely.
Climate Corp.
And I'll be happy to, remind everyone that the YouTube video should be up on our channel. I think there was just a little bit of issues with trimming, which should be re-uploaded within the next hour or so. So if you want to see directly what Matthew was talking about from the CPI, some really hardcore numbers there. Unfortunately, a few of the things that I wanted to ask questions about, but I didn't have time, was the fact that, nuclear was left out of the discussion entirely from his presentation and slides. Renewable energy, as a result of the United Nations and some of the more international boards not recognizing nuclear as technically green, meant that financing the climate crisis would be through strictly other renewable resources such as wind and solar. However, he even did allude himself when I asked him a question later about the future of nuclear. He said it must be a part of the discussion because we don't reach completely renewable by 2050 if we don't. So even Matthew's numbers himself, he admitted reaching the financing to get to 2050 carbon neutrality will need to be revamped and reanalyzed to account for the need to include nuclear in those discussions. And this is why I'm going to, again, recommend that maybe the Campus Climate Corps team on the ground go visit the French pavilion this year and ask a little bit about their SMR developments, as right now, Macron has been touting his new proposal, the 15 billion euro proposal, to get close to 11 or 12 SMRs active by 2028 in France, which is only 6 years down the line. Not only does this replace some of the older systems and modules that they're currently using, but introduces, I think, 4 new modules to almost make the entire country currently utilizing nuclear power. Anyway, we're coming towards the end of our hour today. So any final thoughts from the Campus Climate Corps team on the ground? And John will definitely be looking forward to carrying on this topic tomorrow.
Yeah, I just want to say we're going to have Delaney back on Friday, and that'll be right after the Youth and Future Generations Day tomorrow. So I know all the people on the ground are going to try and make sure that we get some opinions from the Egyptian youth. And, I will definitely be here trying to see what people are actually thinking of. But I'm excited to have her back so she can talk a little bit more about Finance Day, what she's doing here, and of course, have a little bit more insight on the youth and what's up with us.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Looking forward to having her back on Friday. Esteban, John, any final thoughts before we close off today?
Not yet success, but I'm working on trying to get the French Pavilion and an interview there. It will be interesting. I'm also looking to obtain some material from the German Pavilion because, as you may know, they've halted the closure of their nuclear facilities given the energy crisis. And who knows what could happen in the future given the current scenario.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there are two pavilions this year on nuclear. The Nuclear for Climate, the smaller one, typically with the younger professionals, and then this year a new one. The IAEA has a pavilion.
Wonderful.
Like
Has
Holly's having a
Sebastian
good
been
time
around?
there.
Have you seen him, run into him again?
I have not.
Okay, I think he is attending this year. He sent me a message that he'd be willing to talk or give us an interview at any time. So I'll pass along his regards. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for attending today's Campus Climate Corps Day 5 briefing. We're really glad to have you all here. As a reminder, you can reach out to any of our social media handles or send me an email. So happy to go over any topics that you would like to see discussed at COP27 during our daily briefings. In the meantime, thank you everyone for tuning in today. I think we got a good discussion on climate finance, heard some great interviews by Nicola Sturgeon, and of course talked about finance again with Dr. Capiz towards the very end. Stay tuned tomorrow as we go into even greater and more fun topics. But remember, as a reminder, if you want to reach out to us and suggest to us what topics you'd like us to discuss, please feel free to do so. Until tomorrow, this has been Campus Climate Corps signing off from Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt.